held the oceans in his hands, who has numbered every grain of sand. Kings and nations tremble at his voice. All creation rises to rejoice. Who has given counsel to the Lord? Who can question any of his words? Who can teach the one who knows all things? Who can fathom all his wondrous deeds? Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Who has felt the nails upon his hand, bearing all the guilt of sinful man? God eternal, humble to the grave, Jesus Savior, risen now to reign. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. You will reign forever. You will reign forever. You will reign forever. You will reign forever. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him.
All right, good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing this morning? Good. I've asked Michael to lead us in a word of prayer. We got some coming in the back door. Give him just a second. Michael, go ahead.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this wonderful day you gave us. We thank you for the time that you allowed us to come out this morning to worship you and sing praises to you. Lord, we thank you for the rain that you provide for us. We ask that Lord, it's yours here so that it can be fulfilled. Lord, be with us as we go through this period of worship. Lord, be with Brother Man as he has a class prepared for us and help us to have open minds and open hearts and ready to receive your word. And Lord, also be with Brother Translator as he comes and brings us your message of us to be attentive to him and take what he teaches to us and apply it to our lives. Lord, be with those who are sick or unable to be with us this morning. Be with them and give them a measure of their health back to fit your will. And be with those who are traveling all around. Keep them safe and help them to come back to us safely. Lord, forgive us of our sins in Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you, sir. Is everybody recovering from the chili cook-off? There was a couple of chuckles, but it was a good time had by all, I think it was, so I enjoyed myself. I know that some of us are somewhat disappointed because, I'm not going to mention any names, but somebody said, well, I enjoy a good bowl of chili, and, I'm a chili connoisseur, and then that particular person didn't make any chili. So, well, we appreciate your consideration. So, what have we been talking about up here? Which ones? The young ones. The young ones? The small ones. Huh? The minors? Okay. Does minor mean that they're less important? No. Just means that their books are shorter. And we have specifically been talking about the prophet Joel the last couple, we started last week. Probably have about 3 weeks on this, maybe more, but some things about Joel. Joel's name means Jehovah is God. We've talked about, we don't know much about Joel personally. We know that he is the son of Pethuel. And we know that he was an uncompromising preacher. We don't really know for certain when the book was written. There was a couple of different dates, and since there is some question as to whether it was written here or written here, I just kind of sidestepped the question, because when it was written is not as important as the content that was written. And the theme of Joel's book could be stated as the day of the Lord. And of course, we talked about last week that we're going to see that used in 2 different ways. And in our study of chapter 1, we looked at it as being used as a day of judgment. And we talked about this large swarm of locusts. And we talked about different, we kind of helped frame our minds on just how destructive this was. And so Joel 1:1 to Joel 2:27, when we talk about the day of the Lord, is talking about this plague that is afflicting God's people. And it's afflicting God's people because they had transgressed against God. And the book doesn't specifically mention what their transgression was, but they had undoubtedly transgressed against God. And the locusts were the consequences of their transactions. And then today we're going to be in Joel chapter 2, and picking up Joel 2:28 to the end of the book, the day of the Lord changes. It shifts a little bit, and it talks about a day in which Israel would have the opportunity to be delivered, to be saved, to realize their salvation, and that the enemies of the nation of Israel would be destroyed. So, somebody, please catch for us Joel chapter 2, verse 1.
Blow the trumpet in Zion and sound an alarm among the mountains. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, for it is at hand.
All right, so we're picking up, and we've talked about this locust plague and all of the description that we see in chapter 1 is all the devastation that this locust, and we talked about it last time, we talked about in modern day times. We have seen locusts on the continent of Africa that covered 460 miles. And as a reference, we said that Stewart County is 454 square miles, counting the water and land. And so a swarm the size of Stewart County, and they estimated that there was between 80 and 100 million locusts per square mile. So you take that and you multiply it, you take 80 to 100, and you multiply that times 460, and you multiply that times 1 million. How many locusts do you have? A lot. And we talked about that a swarm that size could eat about 400 million tons of vegetation in a day. 400, and we talked about that. If you were to figure that up in terms of semi-trucks, that would be basically bumper to bumper, your average semi-truck weighing 80,000 pounds, it would be a convoy bumper to bumper 66 miles long of how much vegetation they could destroy in a day. They are basically, the chapter 1 basically talks about how he's just taking everything down to the finish, if you will. Taking it, just complete and utter destruction. And so now we're picking up in chapter 2, and he says, blow the trumpet in Zion and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord, there's that phrase, for it is at hand. Now, blowing the trumpet signified different things. In Numbers chapter 10, verses 2 and 9, if it'll pull up, I'll read it for you and save you the time of turning there. Make 2 silver trumpets for yourself, verse 2, Numbers 10:2. You shall make them of hammered work, and you shall use them for calling the congregation and for directing the movement of camps. And in verse 9, when you go to war in your land against the enemy who oppresses you, then you shall sound the alarm with trumpets, and you will be remembered before the Lord your God, and you will be saved from your enemies. He's telling them to blow the trumpet. This basically, the trumpet was an alarm when they were under attack, and they are under attack here. They're under attack by this swarm. And this swarm, again, is the consequences of their transgressions. In Jeremiah 4:5, Ezekiel 33:3, you see other examples of horns being blown. These horns were to sound the alarm, and it would cause the inhabitants of the city to tremble in fear, because when they heard this alarm, when they heard this horn being blown, they knew that it meant impending danger. And when he references Zion here, he's talking about Jerusalem. My holy mountain is also a reference to Jerusalem, or possibly, and even more specifically, the temple that's located in Jerusalem. But we see this phrase again, the day of the Lord. And when we get in the latter part of this chapter, we are going to see how that changes and why it has even more significance. All of this is significant to us. There's lessons in every verse, but even more significant to us. Somebody read verse 2 for us, please. Thank you, Billy. So again, it talks about a great people, a people great and strong. Again, we talked about this last week, and I don't want to get too deep in this. There's different schools of thought are the locusts literal, and it is a literal swarm of locusts? Are the locusts metaphorical, and they represent an army that is being taken in? And then there's also some subsects of that. Is the locust literal in the beginning, but then we switch to a people? Listen, don't get caught off in that. Basically, the idea here is they transgressed against God, and they are suffering the consequences. I personally believe that the locusts are literal, but some want to say, well, verse 2, it talks about now there's a people, a strong people coming. the commentators are muddying the waters. The idea here is that there are consequences for transgressing against God. The important thing to remember is this is a judgment of God enacted upon them. The destruction being described is real, no matter what specific tool, whether it is literal locusts or what is figurative locusts or refer to an army. The destruction is real, and they have faced this devastation, and they are suffering for it. Somebody read verse 3. Any questions on that? Because, again, the commentators kind of want to muddle it a little bit, and I just don't agree with that.
One question on the first part of it. The day of the Lord is at hand. Is that meaning the same thing as the book of Revelation when John was writing? He said on the Lord's day there one time. Does that mean the same thing as it did in Revelation?
And again, in the book of Joel, we're going to see that phrase, the day of the Lord, and it's going to have two different meanings, and we're going to see it shift. And so the day of the Lord early on is referring to the locust plague that they are suffering. But in Joel chapter 2, down towards the last part of the chapter, we're going to see that it's going to look forward, and the day of the Lord is going to be a prophecy at that point, and it's going to refer to, and I don't want to get too far into it because I don't want to read ahead, but the meaning does shift. Because the day of the Lord here early on talks about the locust plague. And then later on, and you remember we've heard in this auditorium before sermons on the twos, if you will. Isaiah 2, Joel 2, Daniel 2, Acts 2, and it talks about God building his house, developing a people, and providing them a day of salvation. And so to not foreshadow too far ahead into our lesson today, but with those twos, we see what Peter quotes on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, he gets from Joel chapter 2. And so we see it early on in the book of Joel as referring to the locusts, but then we see it shift after verse, there's an imaginary line, if you will, between verses 227 and 228, where the phrase, the day of the Lord, shifts to a prophecy of salvation and deliverance for the people of Israel and for us. So.
Okay, then today, every day is the day of the Lord, right? After the salvation comes.
We should certainly live it like every day is the day of the Lord, but. So.
I think.
You're welcome. Hopefully that was clear. Can you explain it to me? Can you explain it to me?
Not afraid of you.
Can you explain it to me?
Can I explain it to you?
No, it was a bad joke, and it's just getting worse, so now we'll move on. Verse 3, somebody.
A fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them the desolate wilderness. Surely nothing will escape them.
All right. This is one thing that I have to constantly work with myself. I want you to think of the imagery that is being conveyed here and the message within that imagery. A fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns. Watch this. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them a desolate wilderness. What do we think of when we think of the mental image of the Garden of Eden? Paradise. Everything's good, right? What else do we think? Y'all talk, not me. Lush and green, and just everything that you'd ever want, correct? Full of life, plenty. All of those are great examples. And so they're using, Joel is using the Garden of Eden to describe it. They had everything they wanted, but they transgressed God. And now, before this swarm, a fire devours before them. It's likening the swarm to a fire. If you've ever just sit and watched a campfire, you watch fire just consume the wood. Hopefully you just watch fire, because we have a lot more devastating examples of how fire consumes. And then behind them a flame burns, and a desolate wilderness. You see the transition, the juxtaposition, the contrast between what they had and after the swarm, what they have. and you see, and just think about the Garden of Eden, the pinnacle of perfection in material terms, and then they have nothing. They have desolate wilderness. You just think about the imagery that is conveying, and just think about, what devastation, because again, just don't read the words and just think, okay, they lost everything. No, they lost everything. And also, don't skip by on this, and actually I did in my preparation, and then it was pointed out to me in my study, but it's also neat. Neat is probably not a good word. That's a high level word right there. It's neat. It is very intriguing that Joel mentions the Garden of Eden. What does that mean? Of course, Joel was inspired, but what does that mean? Joel knew of the creation. He knew of the Garden of Eden. He knew of the God's creation account of the earth, and he knew man's fall. And all of this is evidenced very subtly by just a mention of the Garden of Eden. And so you can unpack just a lot. Joel knew about the creation just by his mention of the Garden of Eden. Verses 2, 4, and 5, please. All right, thank you. So, again, imagine old movies. Who's watched movies where they have horses stampeding and cavalry officers charging? And chariots. It's a quiet affair, right? That's all you hear, right? You probably hear them from a couple of miles. I mean, and you think, just this stampede. You ever seen a movie where somebody got lost in the stampede and they're trying to dodge everything? They look real happy, right? They've always got this carefree look on their face. Oh, hey, look at the pretty horses. Think about that and just Hollywood's interpretation of it, and think about, again, the imagery that this is bringing about. It's like swift steeds. It's like chariots. And then think about this. Have you ever tried to take a chariot? I know you haven't. It's a rhetorical question. Think about it. But have you ever tried to take a chariot over the top of a mountain? No, that's not really, where they're best suited. What does it say here? Over the mountaintops they leap. It's talking about these grasshoppers, or these locusts, and it's talking about how they are just, nothing is stopping them. They sound like a stampede. They sound like a stampede of chariots, and nothing is stopping them. They're leaping over the mountaintops, and like the noise of a flaming fire that devours stubble, like a strong people set in a battle array. Everything is being destroyed. Everything is being brought down. And why? Who brought this about? Not who caused it, but who affected it. They caused it through their transgressions, but who affected it? God. And God always wins. The unrighteous never win. Verse 6, please.
Before them peoples are in anguish, all faces grow pale.
All right. Can you imagine sitting and watching? You've been out in the fields for weeks prior, and you've been laboring. They didn't have John Deeres. They didn't have Kubotas. They were out there with hand tools and plowshares, and they were, tilling the land by hand, and they're trying to raise these crops. And then here comes these locusts and tear down. It's not just their food, and that's bad enough, but it's also the fruit of their labor. And you think about, just watching. Have you ever? What's a good example? Have you ever worked on something? It was like yesterday. We'll use a hypothetical. Let's say that you spent a lot of time putting together your delicious pot of chili. And then let's say that you put it on the stove to let it simmer and you didn't turn the burner down. and let's say that you got distracted and you come back and you burn up your chili. Over something like chili, how upset would you be? No.
Probably pretty good that if you spend, depending on how long it takes, an hour or so making it.
Exactly.
All go to waste.
Takes an hour to get all the cans of beans and tomato sauce open. So so you just, and you just think about how it's just like, you just drain. And so think about that. So here's the fruit of their labor being destroyed. Here is the future of what goes in their stomachs being destroyed. And so they're writhing in pain. There's a great loss caused by these locusts. And it has implications on so many levels because, it's the destruction of their labor. It's the destruction of their future food. It's just, the fear of, it's kind of like I can imagine Brian Deal feeling when that car went through the wall. You just don't know what to do. And it's like, now I got this big hole in my wall, and I don't know what to do. And we mentioned our plumbing problems back in 2019. And you're just standing there, and you don't know what to do. It's just like you've got all these problems, and you don't know what to do. That's where they were at. But my examples don't even scratch the surface of what they were facing. Don't lose sight of that. Somebody read verses 2:7 and 2:8, please.
Before we get to that, I think something else that's interesting to point out is the end of verse 4. It wasn't a rapid destruction. It was something that was pretty quick in happening. Because it says, life with speed, so they run. So it's not something they can prepare for it. It was just happen quick.
Yeah, there's no way for them to prepare, whether it was fast or slow. There's no way for them to prepare because, what are you going to get with fly swatter and just go out there and go, bad locust, bad locust. So yeah, quick or slow, but yeah, it come over them. The reason I say that is because there is some question, and again, it's where commentators are muddying the waters. I don't think it's an important thing, but I think your point is probably right that it come up on them quick. But some would say, I don't know, and you don't want to get into supposition. But the key point there, I think, that you made is there was no way for them to prepare for it, other than maybe not transgressing against God. I think that's the primary lesson, is not transgressing against God. That's how they should have prepared for it, is doing what God had asked of them. And they didn't, and these are the consequences. But as far as man dealing with the locusts themselves, no, you're absolutely right. There was no way for them to prepare other than man dealing with God in a righteous manner. But thanks for pointing that out. And while you're there, hey, go ahead and read 2:7 and 2:8, please.
They run like mighty men, they climb the wall like men of war. Everyone marches in formation, and they do not break rank. They do not push one another, everyone marches in his own column. Though they run between the weapons, they are not cut down.
And so here Joel is anamorphizing or giving human characteristics to the locusts, like mighty men. They climb the wall like men of war. They march in formation. They don't break ranks. They don't push each other, meaning that they do what they're supposed to do. And they lunge between the weapons and are not cut down. Somebody read Proverbs 30, verse 27. Proverbs 30, verse 27. All right, thank you, Jeff. The locusts have no king, yet they all advance in ranks. Locusts clearly are a bug. And they have an individual mind, but when they get together, they operate as a unit, and there's lessons in that. We'll hold it off to the end of the lesson, and maybe next week before we get it, because we've got about 12 minutes before the first bell. But here the swarm is being described as an army formation, and it's given human characteristics. And the locusts are working together, and I'll just let you know, you think about what I just said and think about the lesson that we can learn from that. What can you learn from a locust? And then somebody read verse 2:9, please.
They run to and fro in the city. They run on the wall. They climb into the houses. They enter at the windows like a thief.
The locusts have gone through the land and they have devoured all they can, and now what? They are making their way into the windows like a thief, it says, and they are making their way into the homes, and they are devouring what is not in the field because they've gotten that. Now they're going in and they're devouring what is in the houses. Utter and total destruction. Verse 10, somebody, please.
The earth quakes before them. The heavens tremble. The sun and moon grow dark. The stars meet their brightness.
Again, imagine the picture being drawn here. Some of this description may be hyperbole or being not meant to be taken literally, like the heavens trembling or the earth quaking. Maybe that's hyperbole. But it is very possible to believe that from a point of view of someone standing on the ground, that the sun and the moon did grow dark under the cover of the swarm. Because you just imagine, if you're standing there and and we said it's 80 to 100 million locusts in 1 square mile, and you look up at the sun and there's 80 to 100 million locusts and they're all swarming about trying to look for something to eat. Can you imagine? Yep, the sun and the moon very well did grow dark. So you just, again, think about the level of destruction that Joel is trying to communicate here. Verse 11, the Lord gives voice before his army, for his camp is very great. For strong is the one who executes his word, for the day of the Lord is great and very terrible. Who can endure it? Joel makes clear, and I asked this question a while ago, here Joel is making clear what the answer to that question is. Who is behind this? God is behind this in answer to the people's transgressions. And the locusts are his army. And we see again the day of the Lord. For the day of the Lord. And different translations, because it says in my translation, the day of the Lord is great. If you look at the different translations, and I had somebody the other day ask me, well, which translation do you think is best? And I used to have some strong opinions, and I think that probably you should understand how that translation was derived, the committee of translators that put it together, but the best translation for you is the one you're going to read. And you should read it with understanding of how it came about, because there are some translations and some nuances to different translations. But I would suggest that, with digital Bible tools and what have you now, always kind of go through the different translations to see how certain words are rendered. And so my translation says the day of the Lord is great. The NIV says dreadful. The ESV and the New American Standard Bible 2020 says awesome. The ASV and the RSV says terrible. The idea there is that we are getting this picture that the day of the Lord would be mighty, it would be powerful, it would be sorrowful, it would be dark for those who were on the wrong side of righteousness. And so,
It would be stronger than any man created.
absolutely.
We have a nuclear bomb, but God could be strong. We cannot create anything like God.
Exactly. The strongest bomb that was ever created, the Russians created it, was called Tsar Bomba. And it is the largest nuclear weapon that was ever created. And Kyle Butts talked about this at our last CYC. And as powerful as it is, you think about the power that it took to create all of this. And man, the point there, and Wilton, thank you, is God wins. And we need to make sure that we are always walking in the light, walking in step with his wishes and his will. Now, let me ask you this little philosophy question here. Should God be seen as the cause of a natural disaster? No, not today. What about then? There's 2 points to consider. Let me go ahead, because first, the people of that day, they considered God was responsible for everything. In their covenant relationship, the people of Israel had a covenant relationship with God, and so there were spiritual blessings, but there was also physical blessings. And if they were keeping that covenant relationship with God, there would be material blessings and spiritual blessings. And if they were not in a covenant relationship with God, there would be a curse. And so back then, those people didn't even know what a natural disaster was. Everything in their mind, due to their covenant relationship with God, was because of God. They wouldn't have had the word natural disaster. They wouldn't have understood it as we understand it, because everything happened because of God. And quite frankly, think about how, if we consider, because when something good happens to you, if Wilton comes in and says, "Terrence, you look very nice today," that's a really awkward pause. If we take everything that happens in our life as good and we give thanks to God, then what would that do to elevate our spirituality? Understand, the days of the miraculous age have passed. Miracles have served their purpose. We see that in 1 Corinthians 13. The love chapter of the Bible, they were all fighting over miraculous gifts, and basically, when I was a child, I dealt with things as a child, but as I grew up, put them away. That's the point there, that miraculous gifts and miracles have ceased. God works naturally now. And so the 2 points, today we have nature. Back then, they saw everything, and in this case, absolutely accurately, that God was the reason for this swarm. And because they had that covenant relationship, and in that covenant relationship, there was material blessings and there were spiritual blessings. And you can see that, we can back that up with what we read in Deuteronomy 27 and 28, as far as the covenant relationship and the material blessings and spiritual blessings, and the consequences of them being righteous in the sight of God, and then the consequences of them not being righteous in the sight of God. And so when something bad fell upon the people, the prophets did not ask who did it. They knew who did it. They knew it was God. The question they asked is, why did God do it? So today, if a flood happens, I'm not going to blame God for that. But back then, because it was under the old law, and because they had this covenant relationship, they asked, why did God do it? More specifically, they should have asked, what sin caused God to do it? And so while we don't necessarily have natural disasters today that that you can attribute to God, maybe God did it, maybe God don't. I don't speak, I speak what His Bible says. I don't speak, I don't guess any further than that. But when something happens, we need to examine ourselves. I think that's the lesson there.
That reminds me also of what happened on the day of crucifixion.
Yes.
Because same things happened that day. He was doing it to get their attention. They knew they had earthquakes. They knew that they had rain clouds, but nothing like that.
Exactly.
That's what he was doing, trying to get their attention.
And we're going to get deeper into that, and we're not going to get there today, because Joe I can see his head doing this, which means he's counting. And then that's just a couple of minutes away from, so.
Since you had the boldness to bring up such a deep theological question with like 10 minutes left in class, I'll try to not use the rest of my time, but I do something I want to point out is, if you're someone who reads the Bible and like this is actually a question that really, really kind of nags at you, I encourage you to continue and study and read on that, because I would say for the first about half the Old Testament, what you said is for the Pentateuch and for Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, bad things happen now and then to good people, but for the most part, all of those stories are written from the perspective of,
if you obey God, good things happen.
Yes.
When David became king, when he disobeyed God, what happened? He was punished. During Joshua and Judges, when they obeyed God, they had success. When they disobeyed God, they were punished. But there's a major shift at the end of about 2 Kings. And then, if we were studying the major prophets, this would be a huge theme. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, of the people saying, well, wait a second. We obeyed God, and the enemy still came and destroyed our cities. So what did we do? And so, really, the entire book of Lamentations, which is a lamenting, it's a crying out, is written from the perspective of prophets who were like, we thought we were doing the right thing, but bad things still happen to us. Am I wrong? Am I not doing the right thing? Is my conception of God totally wrong? And so they kind of struggle with that in the major prophets. And there becomes this understanding through the word of Jeremiah, through the words of Isaiah, that, you know what? Even if we endured suffering in this life, because of God's faithfulness to his people through all time, he will reward us in the next. And that's when we see the prophets start looking forward, and that's when we see this shift from, again, this day of the Lord language, not just meaning an end of all things and a time of destruction, but the day of the Lord is the Messiah, the day of the Lord is this coming good thing. And that's when everything starts looking forward, and of course that's when we have Jesus who fulfills that, and it's a question that libraries of books have been written trying to answer, but that's at least the 4-minute answer.
And the key point out of that I want everybody to hear is that we need to be forward-looking. Devin did a wonderful devotion last night for the youth on being content. And by the way, hopefully we'll get more Freddie stories. Some of you got that. Anyway, but we need to be forward-looking. You think about like Paul and everything that happened to Paul in his ministry and being imprisoned and being wrongfully imprisoned. And what did Paul do? Paul kept working for the kingdom. He kept looking forward. He kept working for the future, and not the future necessarily here on earth, but for the future that has a promise of a home with God in heaven. And so that's what we, taking that and going, why did bad things happen to good people today? Well, because there's sin in the world and there's all kinds of free will, and and we need to be working towards serving God so that we can know a home with him in heaven. Looking forward to tomorrow here is futile. Looking forward to a home with God in heaven is where the treasure is to be found. So there goes Joe to ring the bell.
You made a statement there a while ago, but I believe him said he looked nice today. We do not look at a person's body, we look at their heart.
The point was you were blessing him with a compliment. So
Look at the person's heart.
so you're saying you don't think he looks nice today?
No. Hey, I've seen some. I'm gonna say this.
We should probably just move on.
I've seen some
Wrap this up.
until they open their mouth.
Any questions about what we've covered? We really don't have time to move on from here. So
That's what they have to do about those people that are trying to change their heart.
So next week what we're going to talk about is Joel gives the answer, what should we do? And of course we know that's one of the most important questions in the Bible. It's asked on the day of Pentecost, and we'll talk about that. Men and brethren, what shall we do? Joel is going to tell them what they should do in answer to this, and we're going to see that shift in the meaning of the day of the Lord happen here in just a few verses. So, but again, any questions about that?
Fear God and keep his commandments. That's what we do.
All right, guys, well, we're going to end it right there, and thank you all.